Should be much better. Okay. Hopefully people can hear me. And if you can't hear me, I don't know what to do. But I think you should be able to hear me. Put this in the Discord as well. The Discord. What would it be? Twitch.tv/Rhetoric Prof? Twitch.tv/Rhetoric Prof. That is what I am. Professor of Rhetoric. Man, I always do this out of order. I do all these things after I go live. Anyway, this is going to be a read-through. I'm not sure. I mean, the idea here, the ideal idea, would be to do a read-through of this whole weird old book, all 4 volumes of it. That would probably take me years to do. But I figured I've wanted to reread this book. And I think it has like some pretty interesting stuff in it. So I thought maybe we could read it together. So I'll do little pieces of it, popping in and out. And I think that Quintilian is important for lots of reasons. I think that people you probably haven't heard of Quintilian. It's pretty unlikely that you have, unless you're a specialist in the same kind of stuff that I am. But he was really important in his own time in the Roman Empire for thinking about rhetoric. How could you best train someone to speak? And on the one hand, he kind of collected a whole tradition, a Greek and Roman tradition of rhetoric. And he also became really important in the Renaissance because a lot of people, the manuscript of Quintilian was forgotten for many years. It was in some monastery somewhere, and when it was rediscovered, certain Italian humanists, starting with, there were a number of Italian humanists, I don't want to get too into the details here, started to champion Quintilian as a textbook, really, that you could teach in classes at that time. And that had some pretty significant changes. I mean, it started to change the way that people thought about it, because it was far more comprehensive and detailed than anything, say, in Cicero, who they really liked too. So welcome to the stream if you're coming right now. We're going to do this weird read-through of this old book. What? Copernium, what the hell is that? By Quintilian. But really what's going to happen is, hopefully it's like a jumping off board for thinking about how this ancient text and some of its ideas might apply to our lives and our situation now. Why would we believe at all? Like, could you do this with any ancient text? I mean, probably in some way. You know, I have a weird one right here, The Carnal Prayer Mat, which is an erotic novel from China in the 17th century. But I mean, I feel like, as opposed to The Carnal Prayer Mat, which was designed in its own time for, well, you know, various purposes. I think that Quintilian is a whole tradition of thinking about how to speak, how language creates effects in people, and that idea is something that I'm still really concerned with. I think that you might be too if you're coming to watch this stream called Rhetoric Prof. So without any further ado, maybe we can read along, and I'm not really sure how it's going to go. This is the first time I'm doing this. But thinking about a new genre of public education, or education made for the public, which is trying to translate esoteric work into something that could be, I don't want to say accessible. I don't think it's accessible in the sense that it's easily accessible, but at least something that you don't feel intimidated by picking up. I mean, 4 volumes of Quintilian, you're not going to go to your local library and be like, yeah, let's get started on that. That's not likely to happen. But maybe you will after you see that, like, okay, there's something that's interesting here. This is already free on Google Books. This is already free. So you can go to Google Books and type in Quintilian. I like the Loeb Library Edition because they have a translation. Because we'll see, as you'll see, we'll get into it very shortly here. This is the introduction. But once we get into it, and that's why I have 2 pages up at a time. that you have one side over here, which is on the left side, you have the Latin, and on the other side, you have the English translation. I think that's really helpful because sometimes I can read some of the Latin, so I think I can go back and forth and point out certain things that you can get from only the original language. Hey, what's up, aliens? Q. Can you hear me, aliens? Because I know the last time I did this, my setup wasn't working. But hopefully it is this time. I don't know. But because last time I was using my other mic, and I probably could get it working, but I'm not sure. Oh, it sounds good. Thanks, Steve. That's really honestly the reason I got on is because I wanted to make sure it works in my office. So, but now I've committed to this years-long project of reading Quintilian. But anyway, what I'm trying to do is read things that I need to read. But I'm like, well, if I'm going to read it, maybe I'll just go really slow because this isn't something I need to read in an immediate way. But if I read it for someone else, if I have like some purpose to read it, I think that I will. Q is a meme. I mean, Q is. Are we talking about QAnon? Because Quintilian anon would be a hilarious, um, transformation. I don't know what Quintilian anon would be, but Q, yeah. There's also the Q from the Star Trek series. Lots of Qs. Q is like a funny letter. I think we had when we were in grade school. We learned the alphabet in this bizarre, truly bizarre, like tripped out way where they had little blow up animals or blow up letters that were part of the alphabet, and each of them had a story and a character, and we had a big celebration in class when Q and U got married. This was the backstory of these letters. That Q and U got married. It was very strange. It was very weird. I was pretty into it though. I thought it was cool to like you could let letters be alive, and I was into that kind of stuff. But yeah, this is Q, Quintilian anon. That is so new. I don't even know what the content of that conspiracy would be. Um, I don't know. I'm sure that people have had weird theories about Quintilian as being he didn't really exist. He was Cicero or something like that. But Quintilian lived, as it says here. We can go back to the introduction, the brief introduction, so you can learn a little bit about who Quintilian is. Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, and so we call him Quintilian in English. A lot of these Latin names, um, there's all these. I don't want to get into the details. The cognomen, the praenomen, they have different names, but we'll just refer to him as Quintilian. Was like Seneca of Spanish origin. What does that mean? Well, Spain at the time was, of course, there was no such thing as Spain. It was part of the Roman Empire. It was a province of the Roman Empire, and he was born around 35 A.D. So not too long ago. Okay, actually, very long ago. Almost 2,000 years ago, but not quite 2,000 years, but pretty close. His father was a rhetorician, so this is a family business. Got to grab that Twitter handle, Quintilian Anonymous. Quintilian. Is quintillion a real number? Is that at what comes after a trillion? I don't even know. It's kind of embarrassing that I don't know what comes after a trillion. But you don't really need to know those numbers, do you? But that shows you what happened to my education. Quintillion. I don't know. Look that up later. So this is a family business. His father was a rhetorician. He's been doing this for a while. And yeah, it probably is kind of after a trillion. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't. I mean, maybe if you're an astronomer or something, you get to numbers that are that big. But I'm never gonna encounter a number that big. Among his teachers were the famous Grammaticus, which is just another kind of teacher in Rome. Okay, so all this stuff's kind of boring. Completing his education, he seems to have returned to his native land to teach rhetoric there, for we hear of him as being brought to Rome. And this idea of being brought to Rome, who's bringing him to Rome? Some patron. Yeah. By Galba, here we go. This is his patron. Galba is somebody's name. Then governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, which is part of the province of Spain that we were just talking about. Hispania being the Latin name for what we now call Spain. That's where we get the word Hispanic from. It comes from Latin. At Rome, he met with great success as a teacher. He was the first rhetorician to set up a genuine public school. Let me zoom in a little bit, so we can get a lot closer here, I think. He was the first. He continued to teach. Wait, sorry. He was also a successful pleader in the courts, as we gather from more than one passage in his works. He taught for 20 years, so he taught for a while. He talks a little bit about that at the beginning. He's like, he kind of after he retires from teaching is when he sits down and writes this thing, which kind of reminds me of, and I know Steve sometimes teaches Miyamoto Musashi, the Book of Five Rings, and he's like, after I completed my life as a warrior, and I killed 50 people, he's like, I sat down to think, how did I do that? And that's kind of that's a better kind of book. I don't like to read these memoirs of people who are like, how I made $1 million, and they're like 22. And it's like, it always turns out that it's their dad gave them money. It's always the same story. But somebody who's really lived a whole life, a whole career, maybe they do have something to tell you that could be interesting. But both wife and children predeceased him. Okay. He died full of honor. Okay, this is a very Roman thing. Possessor of wide lands and consular rank, which in the Roman Empire, meant something. It meant something. It was an honor, let's say that. The date of his death is unknown, but it was before 100 AD. So he lives kind of during the period, sometimes the period that people might associate with Jesus, around the same time as Jesus, broadly speaking. He left behind him a treatise on the causes of the decadence of Roman oratory, De Causis Corruptae Eloquentiae. So, and this is a trope that they do all of the time. Full of honor. What's that other meme? Is that a moon face? Yeah, that would be that if Musashi was a vlogger, he would have videos like this, or a TED talk. How not to bleed out at Kyoto Street. Yeah, so this is kind of what Quintilian's like. I mean, I don't know too much about his life, to be honest. So we're just getting this little bit of introduction because it's nice to know something about a person before you read 4 volumes of their writing. So the present work, and a speech in defense of a certain Naevius Arpinianus, who is accused of murdering his wife. So, all right. These are the only works known to have been actually published by him, though others of his speeches had been taken down in shorthand. In shorthand, this kind of is a lost art now because it's unlikely you would need to do this. We would just record it. But there's something about shorthand that's interesting, that you kind of would come up with a way that you could write down people's syllables of what they were saying, as quickly as they said them. So that way you could transcribe a speech. And Cicero's slave was the person who invented Tychonian stenography, created the system, because holy crap, can you imagine being Cicero's stenographer? He was always talking, so this guy had to develop a shorthand really quick, and this was one of the standard shorthands. There were a lot of different ones, but this is, up until the modern day. Yeah, shorthand is cool. It's a moon face, but also looks like Thomas the Train. It does kind of look like Thomas the Train. I'm not sure what to do with that, but I'm not going to go into weird Thomas the Train tangents yet. Shorthand is cool. It has an interesting history. It was there was all sorts of weird developments in it, really pretty deep into the 20th century, and now it's like totally gone. I don't think it. I mean, if you could probably find a course on shorthand, but it would be like taking a course on daguerreotyping or something. It'd be like a kind of a hipster thing to do. Not anybody's really doing this for their job or anything anymore. Imagine being Alexander Hamilton's scribe. A similar problem. Yeah, there's just a person who talks a lot, and you're like, take this down, and they just give a 3-hour oration. That would be exhausting. So you'd have to come up with some strategies. And Quintilian also gave some speeches. He had a public career. So similar thing, people were taking down what he was writing, but he didn't seem to be that interested in publishing. He was kind of in this elite, and people probably knew him more as a speaker than as a writer. But now we know him through the Institutio Oratoria, or the Institutes of Oratory, as they're sometimes called in English. Institutes is a weird word, but if you think about it, sometimes we think about institutions as like the oldest possible thing. But if you think about the origin of the word, if we institute something, we're beginning. So it's, in some sense, both. The Institutes of Oratory are the beginnings of oratory. But this is also the thing that's been around the longest. This really is the bread and butter of rhetoric, which is to teach the person right at the beginning. Napoleon had 5 secretaries. Where is he from? Who is he, aliens? Where is Napoleon from? I'm pretty sure he's from Corsica. I'm not sure where is Quintilian from? He's from Spain. So, but he was Roman. He doesn't. If you think of Spanish culture, all of that stuff comes later. That comes from Alhambra. It comes from, Isabella and Ferdinand. it's what Spanish culture would have meant then would be totally different. Yeah, so he's from the Spanish province of Rome, so from the western part of the empire. And I think a lot of people tend to think that like the western part, because of the way that global developments have happened now, that because of colonialism, that the western part was not the that's not necessarily the richest part of the empire. A lot of the wealth was in the east, and that's really. But at the time that he was around, Spain was probably fine. Spain was probably fine. It was like really well settled at that point. So anyway, we don't need to go all into all of that detail. But let's see. So of his character, the Institutio Oratoria gives us the pleasantest impression. This was written in the 20s. This is why it's free on Google Books. So they have like a straight, they're like, this is quite pleasant. Who is finding this old stuff pleasant? Well, people in the some scholar from the 1920s. I don't think scholars today. I mean, maybe some classicists would still say things like this, but it is a little bit quaint. Humane, kindly, and of a deeply affectionate nature, gifted with a robust common sense and sound literary judgment. This kind of stuff. He may well have been the ideal schoolmaster. And even if he wasn't the ideal schoolmaster, in the Renaissance, he becomes the ideal schoolmaster because people like Lorenzo Valla say he is. And they start trying to do what he does, what he recommends. So I don't really know that much about his life, but this is kind of enough. I don't think we need to know too much about his style. So this is one interesting thing here. His Institutio Oratoria, despite the fact that much of it is highly technical, has still much that is of interest today, even for those who care little for the history of rhetoric, which would be most people, right? Not me, I am a historian of rhetoric, but I think most people would say, yeah, why should I care? Notably, the first book, and there's, I forget how many books, but there's like 14, there's 4 volumes, and there's like, I forget how many books, 14 or something. Notably in the first book, his precepts as regards education have lasting value. They may not be strikingly original, but they are sound, humane, and admirably put. And that's what we're going to start with today. The beginning of this book, which is about rhetoric, starts with literally the infant. Infans in Latin means unable to speak. So this culture that he's part of believes that if you really want to teach someone to speak, you can't wait till even they know how to speak. You got to begin before that. Your ability to come into language, how you come into language, is part of your education. And that this is an education that lasts your entire life. Most people let's say if you go to an American university, you take a public speaking course, it lasts maybe 3 months. Maybe you do an accelerated summer course. I've taught these 6 weeks. What is Quintilian saying? Your literal entire life is training in speech. Steve says, one interesting thing about the text is that it was composed in a somewhat political environment to what we see now. This generally accepted idea that political discourse has fallen in quality and there is even less civility than there was in the old days. Yeah, I think that's a trope. It's hard to say if that's, I mean, it's always around, isn't it? Tacitus also writes about this. And he's like, the ancients used to be good. We think of Tacitus as an ancient, but he literally uses this word. The ancients, they used to really know how to be eloquent. Everything is kind of corrupt. And we could talk a lot about that, I think. There's a lot to say about a certain kind of nostalgia for the past and what we think it is. But there's also real changes and real differences. I think one of the reasons that happens so often is that we tend to make our judgments on the basis of comparisons. And we always kind of have to see the present in light of some past. But that past itself is a congeries of images and fictions and stories. And so your sense of the past, even if you are a historian, but I think for everybody, your sense of the past is tinged with a fantasy of how things could have been. And the present seems like just what you're stuck with. That's maybe a more negative way to view it than is always there. But it's always a possibility. Let's forget this introduction and jump in. So sometimes these books have these bibliographies and they tell you all these kinds of things. But you can see one little thing I'll point out is that the Editio Princeps, Rome 1470. Yeah. So the tradition of this manuscript goes back to 1470. But before the 15th century, Quintilian was lost. People knew his name because he was mentioned by other people, but nobody had the text. So can you imagine going to a monastery library and finding more? It's not totally complete. We don't have everything that he wrote, but finding 4 volumes of this text. And you're a humanist, right? So this is a huge discovery. And ever since then, people have been editing and changing words. And when you're editing things, you have to be like, oh, obviously these manuscripts are all copied down. So is this the right word or not? And you kind of have to make guesses. Sometimes it might be a scribal error or things like that. And that's what philologists used to do. And there are still people that do this, but they're not as many as they used to be back in the good old days, as we might say. The English translations of Quintilian, there's one as early as 1805. I would guess, I know that there are ones that are earlier than that, but okay, so past this bibliographical information, blah, 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 blah. And we begin with this weird letter of Quintilian to his friend Trypho. Trypho is a great name for a cat. This is my cat Trypho. I don't know how it would be as a name for a person today. It wouldn't be so great. Welcome to the channel if you're just hopping in. We're about to jump into Quintilian, or as Aliens was saying, Quintilian Anon, a new conspiracy. I don't know what the conspiracy is yet. We'll come up with one, don't worry. So he says, "You have daily importuned me with the request that I should at length take steps to publish the book on the education of an orator." And this is, again, we talked about institution a moment ago, how the institution is the beginning. In the Latin, it says de institutione oratoria. So the institutes of oratory are the education of an orator. How do you begin to make someone speak? Dear Trypho, how's the meow mix? Yeah, this is his friend that is not a cat in this case, but it would be a good cat name, I think. For my own view was that it was not yet ripe for publication. So he's been like working on this for 20 years or something, and he's like, not sure yet. I know this feeling. As you know, I have spent little more than 2 years. I don't believe that. I think he's been working on it for a really long time. Little more than 2 years on its composition, during which time, moreover, I have been distracted by a multitude of other affairs. The word for affairs over here is negoties. There's a little interesting etymology around that. Otium, or otium, means leisure. To not have leisure is negotium, and you could hear that in the word negotiate today. And the same thing, we even have that in English when we talk about business. Really, it means busyness, yeah, not leisure. And so even these kinds of elite Romans still had the attitude, both in their language and in their personas, their public personas, that the business of the day was something really beneath. I'm being distracted with all of this kind of business. I'm always looking for otium, always looking for leisure. And they have this idea of otium cum dignitate, the kind of leisure with dignity, a kind of genteel leisure. And that would be the time that you would devote to scholarship and to scholarly activities. Even the word scholar comes from the Greek in the same way. Skole means leisure time. Oh yeah, it's okay, aliens. I don't know how many brain cells I have running, but it's probably not as many as I could have if I had taken care of myself, had a proper breakfast, slept properly. But despite that, I'm taking on this quixotic task of beginning this reading of Quintilian. We'll see how far it goes. It might not go past the first installment. We'll see. It might just be the institutes of oratory. But this idea of scholars as people who have leisure, I think it's really weird if you compare it to how we think about scholarship today, or school, which comes from the same idea. School is your business. Scholarship is your business. You're busy with that. And then your leisure is finally get a rest. I can play some video games. I can go for a bike ride. I can do something else. So there's a change in attitudes, a huge transformation in attitudes, even though the words have followed us here. And we are I want to learn how to negotiate. That's a good thing, right? Really what it means is not having the time to do the things you want to do. Interesting. Okay. These 2 years have been devoted not so much to actual writing as to the research demanded by a task to which practically no limits can be set. and to the reading of innumerable authors. So he's like, there's not only does this take your whole life, for me to tell you how to do this, there's no real possible end. And this, I kind of feel this a little bit. Sometimes my students are like, well, what's the things that I need to do now? And I'm like, I don't know. It could be anything. And there's not like a clear boundary for what is part of this education and what isn't. Everything can be part of it. But we have to begin somewhere, and that's what Quintilian's trying to get to. Further, following the precept of Horatius was a poet that lived around this time, and he's he is my favorite Latin poet. He's a great poet. If you know the phrase "carpe diem," that comes, or "seize the day," that comes from Horace. That's kind of a little bit of his motto. He was kind of like, let's not worry so much about business, negotium. Let's drink some wine. Let's go listen to some music and poetry. Let's come to our estate. And he got put up in a nice estate by Mykonos, who was a famous patron of the arts. Can you imagine if someone just like bought you a house and was like, write the most beautiful poetry you can? So that's what Mykonos does. So a lot of his poems are to this guy. Slughorn. What is that? What does slughorn mean? This is alien to chat. I forgot to put in OBS the chat this time here, but next time I will put the chat so other people can see it. But for the time being, I will try to translate to people watching this later. That aliens is saying slughorn. I don't know what that means. Is that what happens to your brain when you're Horace Slughorn? All right, I'm going to check this out. Horace Slughorn. Oh, okay, Harry Potter. Yeah, this is not my forte, Harry Potter. That does sound like, it does sound very British, Slughorn. He is. And he is kind of schoolmaster. So Horace is an appropriate name for him. But blood status, that's kind of creepy. Yeah, I don't love Harry Potter. Okay. But now I know a little bit more about it. Okay. Further, following the precept of Horace, who in his Art of Poetry, the Ars Poetica, deprecates hasty publication and urges the would-be author to withhold his work till 9 long years have passed away. The Slughorn is the name of my new funk band. Alan is always coming up with new names for his bands. You must have dozens of bands at this point. So can you imagine, like, yeah, no, I have to wait 9 years. This sounds right to me, but this is not the timetable that any publisher would be happy with today. This relies upon a publishing system that's all based around patronage, where wealthy people and it's very expensive to publish something in this time. Obviously, there's no printing presses. This is about copying, and usually, who would actually be doing this copying? Slaves. So, I propose to give them time in order that the ardor of creation might cool. Literally, refrigerato inventionis amora. Like a refrigerator of invention. I like that. And that I might revise them with all the consideration of a dispassionate reader. But if there is such a demand for their publication as you assert, this is a thing that becomes this classic trope of being like, I didn't want to publish it, but you, my friend, are forcing me to publish it, so I have to do this. And I think this is because there's, like, if you kind of put something out in public yourself, this would be a little bit shameful. You see this well into in Europe. This form comes over and over again. My friend, simply because you plead, sometimes they'll even pretend that someone stole the manuscript and published it without them knowing. They said, but now that it's out, I have to kind of, at least I can amend the errors that have been made. They always kind of are very shameful that anything gets published. We're living in a much faster world, but everyone has a longer lifespan. Why not slow down again? I agree with you, aliens. I think sometimes the longer lifespan thing is overstated, though, because people look at average lifespans and they're like, oh my god, the average person lived to be 35. That's crazy. But I think what they forget to add in there is that there's a much higher infant mortality rate. So, it wouldn't be unheard of someone living into their 70s or 80s. People couldn't probably live to 100. That would be very, very unlikely. But people did live. The lifespans of people that made it to adulthood maybe were not as different from our own as we sometimes think. And unfortunately, there are also places in the world today where they have lifespans that are, on average, about the same as in the ancient world, partly because of infant mortality and partly because of other infectious diseases that have developed. But so he says, but if there is such a demand for the publication, why then let us spread our canvas to the gale? Well, what does that mean? Let's let the sails rip. So it's a naval metaphor or a expedition metaphor, and offer up a fervent prayer to heaven as we put out to sea. Remember, they often kind of talk about books as being launched into the ocean of the public. But remember, I rely on your loyal care to see that they reach the public in as correct a form as possible. So they have to be correct because people are copying them down, right? So he doesn't want any of the words to be lost. So he's like, okay, if you force me to publish this, you have to make sure it's right. So now we finally get to the beginning. It only took us 30 minutes. We're finally at the beginning. So we're gonna breeze through these 4 volumes. This is never gonna end, but I think it'll be good. It'll help me learn a lot more about Quintilian. So we see over here. This is book 1. This is all. It's interesting here. A little bit about the Latin. This is all in the genitive. So that would be like Quintilian's institution or Institutes of Oratory. Book 1 of all of this. And here it says just book 1, and then it gives you the title. And the Proemium is kind of like a preface, but I would say a Proemium is a little bit different. It's almost more the beginning of a speech. So they're really still thinking more of the book as a speech. Yeah. So here's the preface. Having at length, after 20 years devoted to the training of the young, obtained leisure for study, so finally got that leisure that we were talking about before. He doesn't use the word otium, but it doesn't really matter. I was asked by certain of my friends to write something on the art of speaking. The art of speaking. Can speaking be an art? He doesn't here refer to it as an art, though he will at other places. He refers to it as a ratio. Ratio. Ratio can literally mean reason, but it can also mean method. The word method comes from the Greek, which is kind of like taking along the road, going along the road. That's kind of what method, the image behind method. Ratio is a little different. It's more like the measure, the reason, but it can mean the kind of like a process. So what would be the kind of form that you would take on if you wanted to learn how to speak? So I'm going to write something on that. For a long time I resisted their entreaties, since I was well aware that some of the most distinguished Greek and Roman writers had bequeathed to posterity. Is there anything that cannot be referred to as an art? I would say there are far more things that can't be referred to as an art than that can. But it would be interesting to look at kind of test cases of what an art is. Now, an art for them is going to be different than what we mean. This idea of the fine arts has come to define what we mean by art when we in English. So we think of the fine arts as painting, ballet, things like that, sculpture. When they talked about art, ars in Latin, what they really meant was anything that could. It's a complicated idea, but they would think about craft would maybe be the more obvious thing. So a carpenter has an ars. An ars is something that can be learned, but also has a kind of practical side to it. So it's this combination of, unlike maybe like a purely abstract body of knowledge, it has a practical component. But unlike something that is kind of just any old skill, it could be any skill, but unlike any skill, it also has a kind of order or method to it. So you might be really good at telling jokes. You could think about that as a skill. But I don't think that everyone would agree that there's an ars of or an art of joke telling. You would have to write it. You could write a treatise though and try to convince people. Be like, here are the rules, here are the formula, here's what you ought to do. So that idea of the ars or the art is something that can be formulated into something that's teachable through language. So if something is, and this is what Socrates criticizes rhetoric for in the Gorgias. He says it's not an art, it's not a techne, that's the Greek word for it. He says it's just a knack. It's just something you get through experience. There's no real rule or formula to it. It's a habit. And so this tradition, this Roman tradition, doesn't agree. They're like, no, there's definitely an art. Here's 4 volumes on it. There's a lot of rules. In fact, there's thousands of rules, So that's, I think, the big distinction between art and skill on the one hand and art and science on the other. So art is a little bit of science, a little bit of skill. It's a combination. It's a combo deal. Okay. This seemed to me to be an admirable excuse for my refusal, but served merely to increase their enthusiasm. They urged that previous writers on the subject had expressed different and at times contradictory opinions, between which it was very difficult to choose. And this is kind of where he's showing what he's going to be doing, which is, in some sense, he's collecting everything that's been said previously, and he's going to organize it and sort it through, which is why Quintilian is a major resource. Even though not all of his opinions might be the best, he at least gives you a sense of what all of the opinions were and why people held those, of the people before him. I was moved to comply, not so much because I felt confidence that I was equal to the task, but because I had a certain compunction about refusing. The subject proved more extensive than I had first imagined. But finally I volunteered to shoulder a task, which was on a far larger scale than that which I was originally asked to undertake. Now I feel already overwhelmed of trying to read this thing. Imagine trying to write this thing. I mean, I think that here he probably is being genuine. This is probably a huge task, and he's like, I don't know if I want to undertake this on. This is going to take up the rest of my life. I wished on the one hand to oblige my very good friends, beyond their requests, and on the other hand to avoid the beaten track and the necessity of treading where others had gone before. So he doesn't waste his time just reproducing what people have said before him. So what is he going to do? For almost all others who have written on the art of oratory, and here he does refer to it as an art, artem orandi, that's what he's using there, have started with the assumption that their readers were perfect in all other branches of education, and that their own task was merely to put the finishing touches to their rhetorical training. So he's thinking that, okay, so rhetoric, and this was true later on too in Europe, where rhetoric was kind of the final thing of your training. You learned the grammar, you learned lots of basic ideas about how to make arguments, and then rhetoric was this kind of finishing school. What Quintilian is going to say, no, rhetoric is right at the beginning. It's the root and the branches of education. So this is due to the fact that they either despised the preliminary stages of education or thought that they were not their concern. That's for other lesser teachers. That's for the adjuncts to deal with. Sounds familiar? Since the duties of the different branches of education are distinct from one another. Or else, and this is nearer the truth, because they had no hope of making a remunerative display of their talent in dealing with subjects, which, although necessary, are far from being showy. So he's like, these people who say that they're like the best teachers of rhetoric or speech really are one-trick ponies. They can only do this flashy stuff. When you ask to see their fundamentals, they got nothing. This is kind of the the sports recruiters discourse, right? Of being like, yeah, the fundamentals aren't there. Really, really nice and flashy. All right, he can dunk, but can he dribble? This kind of stuff. He's like, okay. And he's also saying by implication that he can dribble pretty well, and he can dunk. You'll see as we go on. Just as in architecture, it is the superstructure and not the foundations which attracts the eye. But can you imagine if you didn't know how to build a foundation and you called yourself an architect? Not so good. And literally the word fundamenta, which I was saying before, is the word he uses here for foundations. I, on the other hand, hold that the art of oratory includes all that is essential for the training of an orator, and that it is impossible to reach the summit in any subject unless we have first passed through all the elementary stages. Okay, welcome to the stream if you're just coming in. We are reading Quintilian. I shall not, therefore, refuse to stoop to the consideration of those minor details, neglect of which may result in there being no opportunity for more important things. So we got to get the fundamentals down. And propose to mold the studies of my orator from infancy on the assumption that this whole education has been entrusted to my charge. And again, I spoke on this, how weird this is earlier, because infancy literally means unable to speak. So, why is he doing this? This work I dedicate to you, Marcellus Victorius, Marcelle Victorii. You have been the truest of friends to me, and you have shown a passionate enthusiasm for literature. literature. Now, literature here is a translation of what would be in the Latin, literally, where we get the word literally from, letters. So somebody who is, you can still say in French, lettré, that someone who is lettered, we can say this in English too, I guess, someone who's lettered, someone who, literature here doesn't mean what we tend to think of as literature, which are novels, pieces of fiction. That might be part of it. But really, literature that Quintilian is referring to is mostly rhetoric. It's mostly you are familiar with the law, you are familiar with certainly the epic classics, with poetry, perhaps especially in terms of what would be similar to what we mean by literature, but also speeches. You would have to be familiar with Cicero. All of these kinds of things would be part of what is being translated here as literature. So it's not just novels. They didn't really, I mean, they did and they didn't have novels. That's a whole other debate. But it's a little bit of a different idea. But good as these reasons are, they are not the only reasons that lead me to regard you as especially worthy of such a pledge of our mutual affection. There's also the consideration that this book should prove of service in the education of your son, Gaeta, who, young though he is, already shows clear promise of real talent. So he's kind of dedicating this book in this long way, but again, it's about young people. That's what this whole thing is about. And so the specific young man that he is, he's through his father dedicating the book to this young man as well. It has been my design to lead my reader from the very cradle of speech, through all the stages of education, which can be of any service to our building orator, till we have reached the very summit of the art. So cradle to grave, baby. That's what Quintilian is going to be. For me, too, because I'm going to read this till I die. I have been all the more desirous of so doing, because 2 books on the art of rhetoric are at present circulating under my name. So I told you that they do this. They're like, these people have lied, they're circulating things about me, so I'm forced to publish now because people are pretending things are by me that aren't. This is a common trope. Is this true or not? It could be. It could be. It was also not uncommon to publish books under a name of a more famous person, because that was a good way to advertise it. And just be like, yeah, this is Quintilian's book. Why not? I'm going to get the money from it. Let's say it's Quintilian's. So that could happen. But I think a lot of times they do this because they're just like, oh, I'm forced to publish now. One is a 2 days lecture, which was taken down by the boys who were my audience. Oh, there you go. He's like, my students are publishing my notes. Terrible. The other consists of such notes as my good pupils succeeded in taking down from a course of lectures on a somewhat more extensive scale. I appreciate their kindness, but they showed an excess of enthusiasm and a certain lack of discretion in doing my utterances the honor of publication. He's like, you little bastards. That wasn't for public consumption. Consequently, in the present work, although some passages remain the same, you will find many alterations and still more additions, while the whole theme... I accidentally deflated my chip. I don't know. Yeah, this you raise it back up. All right. Consequently, in the present work, blah, 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 blah. So this isn't too interesting. This is still the introduction, though. My aim, then, is the education of the perfect orator. The education of the perfect orator. The first essential for such a one is that he should be a good man. And this is a very famous claim that Quintilian makes, the vir bonus, or vir bonus, that you have to be a good person in order to be a good speaker. It's still a strange idea, and we'll maybe learn a little bit more about why he thinks that, but he really thinks that you have to be good. And what does he mean by good, though? Vir bonus. We'll keep that as a question through our reading. What does he mean by being good? It's not, I think we should avoid precipitously judging that he means, as many people do, that being a good person means doing things that are kind of kind or nice. He says a lot of things throughout the text where it doesn't seem like that's the case. Like he talks a lot about you have to be able to be a good liar. It's funny, to be a good liar is, for many people, especially after Christianity and Islam, that lying would be bad, right? But we do still say that someone is a good or a bad liar. You're a bad liar if you can't like make the lie come off. So he's like, what does he mean by good here? I think it might be a little bit more complicated. We'll see as we go on. Whoops. Why did it change back to that? That's weird. Google Books for such an amazing project. The actual display of it really sucks. And I know there's a new Google Books, and it keeps forcing me to try it. But let me tell you, the new Google Books is even worse than the old Google Books. Not a big fan. Not a big fan of the Google Books display format. But I am very, very pleased with what they've allowed me to get for free. So can't complain too much. All right. So, and consequently, we demand of him not merely a possession of exceptional gifts of speech, but all of the excellences of character as well. And these excellences here are in Latin virtutes. And the idea of vir, man, or vir, man, and virtutes, virtus, virtue, are related in this idea. So this is partly a very patriarchal culture, right? Very patriarchal culture in which being manly and being virtuous kind of identify with one another. But I think it also kind of transforms what we might think about as being good. That being virtuous in this way is really being a fully developed man. And the gender here does matter, as we'll see. But I don't think that means that it's like totally moribund text and we need to stop here, because it comes from a culture that if we were to be there today, we'd be like, wow, this is super sexist. I think we can still learn a lot from it, while keeping in mind that its values may not be the ones that we share. But perhaps you disagree. If you do, let me know in the chat. For I will not admit that the principles of upright and honorable living should, as some have held, be regarded as the peculiar concern of philosophy. So he's already beefing with the philosophers. And this was Plato's argument with rhetoric, and specifically with the sophists, because the sophists, Protagoras in particular, this guy Protagoras, said he was going to teach virtue, which in Greek was arete. And Socrates was like, I don't think you know what arete is. And they went back and forth on this. So from the philosopher's point of view, these rhetoricians teach people verbal tricks. And it only works on the ignorant masses. Yeah, this is a little bit of a caricature. Philosophy develops in a way where not everybody thinks this. But this is one thing that philosophy has tended to hold. So that when it comes to being a good person, what you need is moral philosophy. So this is the idea. Moral philosophy, or a theory of what is morally good, is what makes you good. Or that being good is knowledge of what is good. This is even the Platonic idea. But Quintilian's like, okay, that might be partly a part of it, but I think upright and honorable living kind of means you're able to do stuff, as he goes on to say. The man who can really play his part, as a citizen, and is capable of meeting the demands both of public and private business. The man who can guide a state by his counsels, give it a firm basis by his legislation, and purge its vices by his decisions as a judge, is assuredly no other than the order of our quest. So again, Quintilian's idea of what is being good here is not just like not hurting people. It's not being a good Christian or a good Muslim, being a good Jew. Maybe it's more like being a mensch, being a real person who's going to go out there and do what is necessary for the civic. So being able to meet the demands of civic life, that's closer, I think, to what he means by being good, which is different than maybe what we think. Because I think a lot of people think, oh, politicians, they're all corrupt. Good people are people like me who kind of mind their own business. But for Quintilian, this would be somebody who just minds their own business wouldn't be a good person. They would be ignoring civil life. They would be failing to meet the demands upon them. Everyone needs to participate in this. This is not a democracy, by the way. But you could think about, well, what is the demand upon me of where I fall in my civic order? Is there no demand on me if there is not perfect equality yet? Or does that mean that there's a greater demand upon me? Interesting question. Okay. Wherefore, although I admit I shall make use of certain of the principles laid down in philosophical textbooks, I would insist that such principles have a just claim to form part of the subject matter of this work, and do actually belong to the art of oratory. I shall frequently be compelled to speak of such virtues as courage, justice, self-control. So these are justitia, fortitudine here, temperantia, And those sound like pretty similar to virtues that might be adopted by a religious view of virtue. But again, I think even here he means them a little bit differently. That to be in self-control isn't just self-control in your pleasures, but self-control as part of a public performance, uh, part of a public activity. In fact, scarcely a case comes up in which some one of these virtues is not involved. Every one of them requires illustration, and consequently makes a demand on the imagination and eloquence of the pleader. The pleader here being the speaker. I ask you then, can there be any doubt that wherever imaginative power and amplitude of diction are required, the orator has a especially important part to play? These two branches of knowledge were, as Cicero has clearly shown, so closely united, not merely in theory but in practice. And that's, again, we go back to the idea of the R's that we were talking about before, aliens. R's is that marriage of theory and practice. That the same men were regarded as uniting the qualifications of orator and philosopher. So you need the practical and the theoretical knowledge. And this is something that Cicero goes on and on about all the time. He'd like to think that he was a great philosopher, and he was a pretty good orator. So there you go. That's one model. Subsequently, this single branch of study split up into its component parts, and thanks to the indolence of its professors, was regarded as consisting of several distinct subjects. As soon as speaking became a means of livelihood, and the practice of making an evil use of the blessings of eloquence came into vogue, the evil use of the blessings of eloquence. So this is the idea of, if you really know how to speak well, you can do bad things. And this is why people maybe are suspicious of eloquence or rhetoric or the oratory. Those who had a reputation for eloquence ceased to study moral philosophy and ethics, thus abandoned by the orators, and became the prey of weaker intellects. So he's like, it's not so much that that oratory doesn't require moral philosophy. It does require this stuff. But when people don't do it, it doesn't just mean that they become immoral. It means that they become worse speakers. So it goes in both directions. He's like, actually, oratory suffers. Silver-tongued devil. Yeah, that kind of idea. It's very common, right? Of someone, often maybe someone who's coming from outside the community or from a different class, who comes in and I don't know why, but they convince me of things. But I'm not even convinced by my own persuasion. It's something that they're doing, some kind of magic. Yeah. But Quintilian's like, it's not magic. I'm going to write a big book about it, and you can see how it works. And then you have to practice it. It takes a lot of hard work to be able to do something like this. But you also can't really do it very well or effectively in all of the demands of civil life if you are just trying to get one over on people. That might work in certain places, but that will make you a very limited it'll give you a limited power. You can be a circus barker, but it's not going to work outside the circus. I think that's kind of part of his argument here. So being a good person, the moral part of that, is also what you need in order to speak well on all occasions. So it's a weird idea. Okay. As a consequence, certain persons, disdaining the toil of learning to speak well, return to the task of forming character and establishing rules of life, and to capture themselves what is, if we must make a division, the better part of philosophy. So he's saying that these other people who are like, oh, they got upset with the orators, they just became philosophers, and like they don't want to get into the hard stuff, which for him is learning how to speak and be part of common life. A distinction which neither the greatest generals nor the most famous statesmen and administrators ever dared to claim for themselves. For they preferred the performance to the promise of great deeds. What a great sentence. They preferred the performance to the promise of great deeds. And here he's trying to say that the philosophers like to promise great deeds, but they never really did them. I am ready to admit that many of the old philosophers inculcated the most excellent principles and practiced what they preached. But in our own day, the name of philosopher has been too often the mask for the worst vices. So he's really sticking it to the philosophers now, that these people are actually derelicts of duty. Sub hoc nomine. So in the Latin he says, they go under this name of philosophers. but they're not really true. In fact, the maxima vitia, the worst vices, are hidden under this name in our time. For their attempt has not been to win the name of philosopher by virtue and the earnest search for wisdom. Instead, they have sought to disguise the depravity of their characters by the assumption of a stern and austere mien. Yeah, like their fate, the way they look. They kind of go, maybe they grow beards, they kind of get serious. But they're not really searching after wisdom. Accompanied by the wearing of a garb, differing from that of their fellow men, because the philosophers would wear, in the Roman time, something that looked more Greek. The philosopher's robe. It was really like a kind of similar to religious orders that you might see in Europe or in parts of India. Maybe you see people dress differently if they've kind of taken a religious way of life. Something, or in China and lots of places, right? This is common. If you kind of take what you might seem as like a religious way of life, you're putting yourself outside the hustle and bustle of civil life. This is what the philosopher does. And so the philosophers kind of distance themselves from civil life much of the time. And he's like, yeah, but that's all they do. They don't really want to bother, and so they like put on these clothes and grow a beard, and that's the end of it. There's nothing else. They have nothing else to show for it. Now, as a matter of fact, all of us frequently handle those themes which philosophy claims for its own. So I also know something about justice and equity and virtue. It's not just the philosophers. In fact, I speak it more eloquently. So he's a little bit, I don't know. Is this a fair argument? Hard to say. You'd have to read a lot more about what the other people are saying. But who, short of being an utter villain, does not speak of justice, equity, and virtue. But he's not just saying it's the orators. It's all of our concern. We all are concerned with justice, equity, and virtue. This isn't like a philosophical hobby to be concerned with justice. This is a deep concern, common concern for everyone. Who and even common country folk are no exception. The rustics, this is where the term rustic comes from. The rustics does not make some inquiry into the causes of natural phenomena. So, even if you're a farmer, you got to kind of know something about what would pass as natural philosophy at the time. And the name natural philosophy, even into the 17th century, even into the 18th century, was sometimes what we would call science, was described as natural philosophy. So, as for the special uses and distinctions of words, they should be a subject of study common to all who give any thought to the meaning of language. So Quintilian, he's living in a very unequal time in the Roman Empire, but you could see this, and it has been used, this beginning passage, as an argument for universal education. The founders of the United States, when they were thinking about universal education, would often think about Quintilian and these passages right here. So it's important in that respect as well. But it is surely the orator who will have the greatest mastery of all such departments of knowledge, and the greatest power to express it in words. So the orator, unlike the philosopher, has the power to express it. Not just to know it, but to express it. And if ever he had reached perfection, there would be no need to go to the schools of philosophy for the precepts of virtue. If you've become virtuous, why do you need to learn the precepts of virtue? Praecepto virtutis. That's just the precepts. What are you doing with it? As things stand, it is occasionally necessary to have recourse to those authors who have, as I said above, usurped the better part of the art of oratory after its desertion by the orators, and to demand back what is ours by right, not with a view to appropriating their discoveries, but to show them that they have appropriated what in truth belonged to others. And this is something even my colleagues still say. I'm not always so down with this. I'm like, well, we've been harping on the philosophers forever, and it's kind of boring. It's kind of old. But I think at this point, maybe for Quintilian, he was making an important case about the ideal orator as really the object of education, as opposed to a philosopher. And why did that have to be the case? Why was that so important? Well, it was part of an educational ideal. Because if the philosopher was the perfectly educated person, they were a person who had already set themselves aside from political, civil questions, for the most part. So the Stoics, the Skeptics, these various schools of philosophy, of Hellenistic philosophy, that were still kicking around, really were gaining steam, perhaps, in some quarters at the time of Quintilian. These people who were kind of putting themselves at a distance from common concerns. He's like, well, if that's what education leads to, what's it for? We can't abandon our duties of living together in this civic order. And therefore, education should lead to that. And for him, the image of that person, best equipped for whatever life may throw their way, is the orator. Okay, I don't know what you think. That might be too ancient of an ideal, but I don't know. Sometimes people say now, they're like, hey, if you really want to get a good education, become a coder. And this is supposed to be like a really practical advice. Become a coder, learn how to code, and then you can get a job anywhere. So maybe the coder is a better thing to educate people into rather than the orator. Or some people might say, really what you need to do is you need to know how to manage a team. So you should study management, because wherever you want to go, you want to be the boss. But of course, my sympathies lie a little bit closer to Quintilian, though I think it's, again, a little bit quaint, perhaps, the way he puts it. It is an ancient text after all. But speech, our ability to speak with one another, is really the origin of our ability to live together. And so if we neglect it for our ability to organize technology or platforms, all those other kinds of things are going to, then maybe we'll educate people into something where they might be very efficient at preserving certain parts of a social order, but what makes it work in the first place will be neglected. And then it might result in some pretty bad political orders if we totally neglect this. But even if you don't, it might still be bad. Who knows? These are big questions. Okay. So he goes on to say, still we must nonetheless follow the ideal, as was done by not a few of the ancients, who though they refused to admit that the perfect sage had yet been found, nonetheless handed down precepts of wisdom for the use of posterity. And this was something that the Stoics really believed in, that there could be someone who was perfectly knowledgeable. This was the perfect sage, the perfect wise person. Perfect eloquence is assuredly a reality, which is not beyond the reach of human intellect. So as opposed to perfect knowledge, you can be perfectly eloquent. So it's better to educate people towards something they can actually do. Even if we fail to reach it, those whose aspirations are highest will attain to greater heights than those who abandon themselves to premature despair of ever reaching the goal and halt at the very foot of the ascent. What do you think? Is that true? Do you think that it's better to try to educate yourself towards a goal, even if you know you can't reach it, or choose a new goal that you can reach? It seems like he kind of has both ideas here. I don't know. I have therefore all the juster claim to indulgence if I refuse to pass by those minor details which are nonetheless essential to my task. My first book will be concerned with the education preliminary to the duties of the teacher of rhetoric. So before you get your speaking tutor in, what do you have to do for your child? So this is kind of addressed, again, it was already addressed to the father and the son, and this is part of that reason. Why? Because who is going to make the decisions about what's going on in a young child's life? And this is a very patriarchal society, and as we shall see, women get invoked here, but the person making this decision is going to be the father. My second will deal with the rudiments of the schools of rhetoric, and with problems connected with the essence of rhetoric itself. The next 5 will be concerned with invention, in which I include arrangement. That's an interesting idea. So there are these 5 canons. They're sometimes called canons of rhetoric. They're not canons because they shoot things out. They're canons in the sense of they're the standards of what good speech involves. So the first one was almost always invention. Invention is the coming up, the discovery of things to say. That's what it means in Latin, inventio, to find, to come upon something. And arrangement is like how you order the things that you've discovered. So it's interesting that he kind of includes arrangement in invention. He kind of folds it in together. I like that because I kind of think of it the same way. That you have to kind of, you don't have things that are discrete and then you kind of structure them. The arrangement and the discovery of the things come together. And then the 4 following will be assigned to eloquence, under which I will include memory and delivery. So delivery, not DiGiorno, that part is it. And then memory is really important, especially in this culture, because printing things and writing things is not so easy. So you got to memorize a lot. You have to have it. So that part might be a little bit different for us. It might be very different for us. But I think there's still part of that, and I deal with it in my classes all the time. Should I memorize a speech? Usually when students say that, they write out a speech, and then they memorize the words that they wrote, which is kind of weird. I'm like, don't memorize some piece of writing in order to speak. Practice thinking through what you would say when you speak. practice speaking it. That should be what you are trying to remember. How did I speak it when I spoke it best? Not what did I write when I now I'm speaking. It's two different modalities. So, but alas, we are not so much of an oral culture anymore. Finally, there will be one book in which our complete orator will be delineated. So this is going to be the kind of ideal orator, and this is what Cicero kind of does in his dialogue De Oratore, or On the Orator. And so Quintilian knows who his competition is. He's like, yeah, Cicero, for sure. I got to compete with him. So I'm going to outline what I think is my complete orator will be like, and it'll be a lot fuller and more complete than what Cicero said. As far as my feeble powers permit, a little bit of a false humility here, I think. I shall discuss his character, the rules which should guide him in his undertaking, studying and pleading cases, the style of his eloquence, the time at which he should cease to plead cases, and the studies to which he should devote himself after his cessation. So not only does he want to tell you what you should do with your baby, he's going to tell you as an orator when you should retire and what you should do with your retirement. I mean, this is an entire program for a life. It's kind of a weird idea that this guy is going to write a book and tell you how to live your life, and the whole life is going to be organized around speech. That's really what this project is about, and why I find it interesting, which is it's the grandest, fullest conception of what it would mean to learn public speaking. It's your entire life. I don't think that you should listen to his advice on retirement or something. You probably talk to like a retirement counselor or something like that. But I think the idea that's within the scope of this project is very interesting. In the course of these discussions, I shall deal in its proper place with the method of teaching by which students will acquire not merely a knowledge of those things to which the name of art is restricted by certain theorists. And it goes back to this argument about what is an art and what isn't. He's like, some people want to say an art is only a couple things. But will acquire that which they increase their powers of speech and nourish their eloquence. For as a rule, the result of the dry textbooks on the art of rhetoric is that by straining after excessive subtlety, we don't get too much of that these days. But you can imagine, what would be an excessively subtle thing? It reminds me of once someone was describing wine tasting. And we got to a point where they were describing how one of the desired flavors in wine is an ammonia compound similar to cat piss. And my feeling was, I really don't want to be so refined that I'm spending top dollar in order to sniff out cat piss. If I want to sniff cat piss, I can know. And that might be a little unfair to those oinophiles out there who really have developed their palates. But it might be an excessive subtlety from my humble position. They impair and cripple all the nobler elements of style, and exhaust the lifeblood of the imagination, and leave but the bare bones. The bare bones. So even though they're trying to kind of do these grand, ornate things, really it ends up being, for all of that effort, quite bare. Which, while it is right and necessary that they should exist and be bound each to other by their respective ligaments, require a covering of flesh as well. Which is kind of a funny thing of being like, your outline isn't enough. So this idea of the discourse as a body, again, goes back to Plato. But Quintilian's taking this a lot further, because he's like really getting into the anatomy of what this would be. So he's going to give, rather than this kind of loose metaphor that Plato does, of like, speech is like a body, it should have a head and legs. Quintilian's going to be like, a speech is like a body. Here's Gray's Anatomy of speech. That's what the Institutes of Oratory are. It's a giant anatomical textbook of speaking. So it gets really into the nitty-gritty, the minor details, so to speak. I shall therefore avoid the precedent set by the majority, and shall not restrict myself to this narrow conception of my theme, but shall include in my 12 books a brief demonstration of everything which may seem likely to contribute to the education of an orator. For were I to attempt to say all that might be said on each subject, the book would never be finished. There you go, folks. There is, however, one point which I must emphasize before I begin, which is this. Without natural gifts, technical rules are useless. So just having the rules of art isn't enough. You do need to work from what you have. Consequently, the student who is devoid of talent, student who is devoid of talent, will derive no more profit from this work than barren soil from a treatise on agriculture. Kind of a rough metaphor, but a pretty good metaphor, right? If you there is something about agriculture. It does matter that there are certain methods and things like that, but if you're planting stuff in sand, nothing's going to grow. I have a little bit of a kinder attitude, I would hope, towards my students. And I would say it kind of depends on what your natural gifts are. So I would say that I think everyone probably does have natural gifts. This isn't just a Mr. Rogers point of view. This comes from seriously having considered this and having taught many students myself. And having a broader conception of what might be necessary in our society. Our society is a lot more pluralistic and complex in many ways than Quintilian's was. His was pretty complex too, let's be real. But I think one of the reasons why Quintilian feels like you have to be talented or you got nothing is that there were fewer possibilities, fewer opportunities for how you might express yourself, what speech might do, that civic order, however important it was to Quintilian, his civic order was quite limited to, on the one hand, men. So you had to be masculine and not effeminate in order to get by. Though, of course, that wasn't totally true, but at least from his point of view. But I think, more broadly speaking, that the idea of like what you could do in society, there weren't as many possibilities. But because there's so many possibilities for us, I don't think that this is a great metaphor. I think it's more that you have to know what kind of soil you're working with, and that find the part of rhetoric that will help you develop that. Because you actually can grow stuff in sand. You actually can grow stuff in clay. You just have to grow the right stuff. Okay. There are, it is true, other natural aids such as the possession of a good voice and robust lungs, sound health, powers of endurance and grace, and if these are possessed only to a moderate extent, they may be improved by methodical training. So it's really literal here. He's like, your body has to look a certain way. And I've written like a review of some books about disability rhetoric, where I kind of express my view of like, well, yeah, I don't really agree with this, but I think here he's really thinking that you have to have a very specific set of bodily skills, bodily virtues, and partly that was because if you don't have robust lungs at the time of Quintilian, nobody can hear you. But luckily, we have things like microphones. For if you were deaf at this time, there was no sign language, except perhaps what was invented between people who were deaf. So there's more modes and channels of communication today, and we should be grateful for those things because they allow us to have a broader attitude than maybe it was really possible for him to have in some of these areas. In some cases, however, these gifts are lacking to such an extent that their absence is fatal to all such advantages as talent and study can confer, while similarly, they are of no profit in themselves unless cultivated by skillful teaching, persistent study, and continuous and extensive practice in writing, reading, and speaking. Okay, a few things on that. One, if you're one of my students, see, I'm not as mean as I could be. Quintilian's pretty mean. But I think what the really interesting thing is here is that it's a two-way street. You can think about this as the relationship between talent and training, but you can also think of it as the relationship between student and teacher. That the talent here is the student, not the teacher, but that every talent needs someone to kind of be its audience and to take from a longer experience, kind of point them in directions of where they might cultivate things, they might look to change their attitude on certain things like that. So you need both. You need both in this relationship. The question of who is the teacher and the student can be flipped, though, sometimes. I learn a lot from people who are my students. And I think that, I literally had someone the other day teach me fencing moves. And I was like, I think I'm the student here. So it really depends, that relationships goes back and forth. And partly because rhetoric is so broad. And as he said, we can't draw the boundaries on its knowledge. Who is learning and who is teaching is often not so clear. It's one of the things that I like about my chosen path in life. I might end it there. We have gotten to what seems like a breaking point, which is the end of the Proemium. So after this, to preview where we'll go next time, he starts really talking about babies. And this is some weird Roman stuff. This is some stuff that's pretty unique to the Roman elites of his time. But it is still very interesting to think about. And it comes up in a lot of later works. The reception history on this is very long, where people tried to make this, like in early modern England, people tried to make this into a model for education in a very different culture. So people tried this. I don't know how successful it was, but they really tried to do these very intense forms of education that begin with the infant. So thanks again for coming into the stream, and that's going to be all for today. I will see you next time we stream. Please follow the channel if you haven't already, and this will also be available on the YouTube channel Rhetoric Prof that I have. You can follow me on Rhetoric Prof, and I will make it available there. And there I will probably give it the title. It'll be part of a playlist of videos where, as we go further in, the various sections of the book that we're reading will be available as videos. And you can flip around in those if you'd like. All right. See you next time.